Jonathan, what's up?
How are you, sir? It's good to see you again. Glad to be
Welcome
back.
back.
Glad to be back. Happy day, happy day, happy day.
Back recording. This is good. Back at it. What are we going to dive into today? 2024?
I think so.
2024. So
Here we are, a few months in already.
I know a lot of looking back into 2023. And I know that you recently put together some content on what you're seeing moving forward into 24 and what are some of the trends and yeah, let's just dive in. What does 2024 hold for us in behavioral health?
I think there'll be a continued focus on the steadily rising demand for mental health services, particularly outpatient mental health services, really.
Okay.
We started to see some of that coming into focus at the I would say the trailing part of the third quarter of 2023 and the end of 2024. Everyone's or 2020, the fourth quarter of 2024. People started to look forward and started to think what was going to be the next horizon to really follow. And I think that, the mental health space had been growing from the pandemic forward slowly, sort of behind the scenes, as there was a lot of focus on the opioid pandemic in 2019, 2021. By the time everyone was in safety protocols, quote unquote lockdown, and those experiences, certainly the rise of mental health stress and social wellness came into focus for a lot of organizations and a lot of people, a lot of communities. And I think that 2024 really is the focus for so many, especially in the merger and acquisition space. And when we talk about growth in particular, it's really, we still get a lot of calls with people focusing on, serving the substance use disorder and the addiction treatment continuums and looking at those spaces still. And I think that, that need is still there, although I would say I'd be hesitant when folks start looking at building more residential spaces. When you look at the average occupancy of most facilities is hovering around 75% occupancy. I wouldn't say that there's a tremendous need for more residential spaces in the substance use, but I think more people are looking at the lack of mental health resources in their communities and trying to figure out how to solve that.
So I want to ask a question related to that because you're right in terms of what we're seeing, at least from the leaders in the M&A space and, in our industry, talking about the trends moving, really towards buyers in particular being very interested in the mental health space. But there was an interesting comment made about buyers being a little bit hesitant on severe and persistent mental health services. And I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit. I was kind of taken back. I mean, it's a challenging population, of course, right? There's a lot of liability. There's a lot of considerations, very heavy staffing to work with the severe and persistent mental illness side of our industry. But it was interesting because, again, we're seeing like this trend towards mental health, but it seems like there's this little piece that buyers may be hesitant for that specific. So I'm just curious, like, what your thoughts are.
I think, when talking to buyers or when looking at facility operators who serve severe and persistent mental illness services, a lot of people really misunderstand what those services are, what they look like, and underestimate what it does take to deliver them. There's certainly challenges in being able to have staff who are passionate about that population and serving that population. I think one of the biggest misnomers that comes out is, people are looking a lot of times from a buyer's perspective, at least, they're looking at return on investment and certainly the cost of producing those goods and services of mental health care at that level are higher, right? You need more medical, more psychiatric staff, more trained staff of different disciplines. There's certainly, as you said, more opportunities to look at from a perspective of maintaining safety in an environment for participants in the treatment process. But I also think there's a lot of myth. And I think a lot of people misunderstand it. They have a lot of stereotypes about, intense psychiatric illness and intense psychiatric environments that are just, it's more remnants of people watching One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest one too many times, or
Right.
the sort of dramatized version of what that real care looks like and what's involved in that care.
So that's definitely a piece of it. Do you think it's buyers looking at just margins and saying, look, if these businesses are going to run at 15-20% margin, right, that may not be, we may be looking into sides of the industry that are going to get us 25 and 30%.
I think to some extent, perhaps. I think people are looking at hedging their bets long term, right? With it from an investment perspective, saying what's going to be able to grow over, a 5 to 7 to 10 year period, and how much of the market is there that need that level of service and the intensity of services that often folks suffering from severe and persistent mental health issues need. I think the margins play into it in part, but I think more so it's really a misunderstanding of what's involved. I think
mm,
people look at outpatient, general mental health outpatient, and think there's less risk when really the risk is about equal. There's certainly less, need for certain levels of staff at certain levels of mild or moderate severity of a mental
sure.
health condition. And I think the margins are a little better, but not dramatically. So I think people really misunderstand what it takes, and how you can do it well, and
Yeah.
what the more so the really what's the total available market, the service obtainable market, and the serviceable available market in any given region. And I do think a lot of people look around and they don't necessarily understand how much severe and persistent mental illness there actually is in the domestic US, at least.
Yeah. So we've talked a bit from the buyer standpoint, but what about from the operator, provider, and or organization that's looking to come into that side of the space? Because you say there's definite need. Talked about the trend looking that way from the M&A side, the buy side. What are you seeing on the operator provider side?
On the operator provider side, we're seeing more people looking at growth opportunities in their markets who provide, say, substance use with co-occurring mental health service, really looking at, do they have the capacity and do they have the opportunity to serve primary mental health diagnosis? We know
Got it.
that there are a lot of regions that are dramatically underserved with, say, residential mental health services. And certainly there's opportunity for that. But I think much like there had been for a long time, a gap in the continuum of care, from residential downward, I think there's an opportunity for operators to look at those, growth needs and say, can we and should we start serving that population? And do we have the right staff? And if not, what do we need to do to get the right staff or the right training?
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So
You're seeing
2024.
more regulations too change,
Mm,
or at least people willing to take on some of the what they often perceive as a more challenging regulatory environment with mental health, but really, generally speaking, aren't that much heavier of requirements from a regulatory perspective to serve that population and those people. But more operators being willing to say, I think we should, because I think what they're seeing more and more is people coming in with one diagnosis and one primary issue, and as that stabilizes, the background really comes forward, and the underlying or more severe mental health issue is able to be addressed. For example, with substance use, oftentimes people will escalate with substance use progression in response to unmet mental health needs.
right.
So I think providers are starting to recognize that rather than just constantly referring someone out to whether it's a higher level of specialized care or a specialized outpatient as a part of a continuum, that they want to be able to start meeting those needs where their capacity and training makes sense.
Makes sense. All right. So 2024, we're starting with trends towards mental health care. All right. What else you got, sir?
I think there'll be some certain reimbursement changes and reimbursement stabilizing, in the payer market. We're seeing it
Always a
take,
good conversation here. All right.
yeah, the payer market. So what's getting reimbursed? But I think there's a lot of reform going on, especially at the federal level, looking at regulations such as the DEA telehealth and controlled substance rule updates, looking at the amount of money that the Biden administration had set for its 2023 2024 CMS reimbursement schedule updates and changes to that are finally starting to increase the baseline for a lot of services. As many people may be aware, and for those who may not be, that a lot of commercial insurance is baseline against Medicaid and Medicare in their states and regions, in terms of what they reimburse for services, which then becomes
Sure.
that relational dialogue with providers of trying to get the most reimbursement for services to provide the highest quality of care. And I think as some of those rules get clarified, there'll definitely be some opportunities for looking at medication assisted treatment and telehealth, again, being clarified and done in a way that's really consistent and produces better outcomes, giving some outpatient centers an opportunity to expand perhaps their MAT or multiple pathway profiles
Sure.
in service. But also, from a payer standpoint, it really comes down to seeing some of those things stabilize, because there had been healthy growth and adjustment over, whenever there's economic prosperity, there's more willingness for everybody to spend more. But I think we've seen a lot of rates at different levels of care flatten out in certain areas, in certain sectors within behavioral health, and others are still on the rise. I think we'll see course corrections in a number of areas within behavioral health, and people are, certainly seeking to be on the advanced edge of those, changes. Certainly, substance use, we've seen, a return to, prior to pandemic conditions of reimbursements and authorizations at detox and residential levels stabilize. I think we're seeing, the partial hospitalization or day treatment start to calibrate a little bit. It was a bit of, there were authorization lengths, 20 to 25 days right out of the gate for many partial programs and partial services that are cutting back a little bit, because what, I think payers are finding is, it comes down to the balance of using a plan member's benefit in a strategic way for their care, and too much partial, takes away some opportunity at the next level of care down at the intensive outpatient level, and too much residential doesn't allow for enough room at the outpatient level. So it's a challenging balance, but I think we're seeing some stabilization in what that is. Again, people have been clamoring for the last couple of years, saying that out of network benefits are going to disappear. And as I look around, I still see them, everywhere. So just to be sure, they haven't gone away yet. But
Yeah.
can you make a program work strictly on out of network benefits? It really is market contingent. It's what's available in the market. Is that service in need for those plan members, and what do those rates look like? But that balance and the macroeconomics involved are really challenging to understand. So I think we're seeing, opportunity for things to stabilize differently, while the greater economy is still in question. People are still afraid to say whether we're in a recession or not, or whether we're, facing economic collapse. I was at an industry event a few weeks ago, and someone said we got 6 months before the economy starts to take a turn downward again. And then somebody else said 6 months, and someone said, it's going to be a few years. So there's a lot of opinion in that way. But what we find in those times is that when there's a lot of greater economic uncertainty, there's certainly a balancing of what the reimbursements look like.
So
I
you
think
use
that
terms, sorry to interrupt. You use terms like balancing, stabilizing, right? For providers. Is this good? We're trending in a good direction, or we're trending in a downwards trend, or it's just, again, pretty neutral. It's just a stabilization, just some clarity.
I think it's neutral, really, honestly. I think it's a challenge for providers at some level, because they got very used to seeing upward trending spends in behavioral health. And so people, as costs rise, And as expenses to produce services rise, you want to see a corresponding, increase in the rates that you're getting reimbursed, but there's generally a lag
Mm,
of anywhere from 9 to 18 months before you really start to see that actually happen in the reimbursements. And so those course corrections are fighting each other a little bit, in a way where, payers are trying to balance out what's happening while providers' expenses for services are increasing. So I think it's neutral in the sense that it's calibration in the greater market, and I think a lot of people took advantage of that in their growth, over the period of the pandemic and the initial post recovery period. And the challenge is when people pull out of that market from an investment standpoint and move on to other market sectors, they've basically taken it for what it's worth and have left the existing providers with the challenge of bearing through these economic stabilizations. So while
yeah.
costs of production, costs of providing services have gone up, the reimbursements slowly calibrate towards what might be considered equitable. If you ask a provider what's equitable and a payer what's equitable, you're going to get two very different answers.
Yeah. Well, and you say the out of network conversation continues to amaze me because, we were just at two conferences uh, these past couple weeks, and the conversation continues to come up, especially with investors in the space, saying, how should we be looking at this platform acquisition or, the payer mix that exists? And, we keep hearing that out of network is going to go away. And I just kept saying, I have personally been saying that for 10 years. And it's still here, right? So like, look, I mean, as you mentioned, right, we need to understand what's going on in the market and the market saturation and the specific payer mix that exists and concentration of payers and markets and analyze out of network and in network rates and Medicaid and all this. But look, out of network is still here, even though I've at least been saying for a decade that out of network's going away. And as of March 2024, it's still here. So
Yeah, there's only one excuse me, there's only one true way for it to disappear would be towards more universal health care and a much bigger opportunity. I mean, we'd have to dismantle the way that free market capitalism exists in behavioral healthcare and in healthcare in general for out of network to truly disappear. Now
mm,
will you see more challenges? Will you see longer terms of accounts receivable cycles? Yes. Will you see mixed reimbursements? Yes. You'll see some really low and some really high, and they within the same plan, and they don't seem to make sense until you aggregate the information out and look at it as a whole. I think more people are looking for security is really the question. How do I
sure.
secure things in my business as a provider? How do I secure, better care? And that's where people look towards that in-network opportunity. And again, I think as there's more work in the federal government towards parity regulations of reimbursement, and there's more oversight and criteria that's clarified for what is medical necessity and who determines medical necessity, things that influence these very complex calculations. I think with increases to things like CMS, you're going to see, baseline increases to reimbursements. And again, it would take a dramatic shift in the whole behavioral health economy for out of network to truly disappear, to go away,
Right.
and for payers to be willing to, have adequate services and adequate coverage for their plan members and communities. But I was just notified by someone yesterday that a major payer in the northern part of the Midwest is pulling out of a very large ACO contract that they're a part of.
Mm,
So a huge number of people who have this health insurance are now going to be using out of network benefits to seek care where they were in network at a fixed rate. And, it's going to cause a little bit of fluctuation and change in that market, which is probably a really good thing. It'll give that market a chance to look at its benchmark rates. It'll give other providers a chance to, look at better in network rates, that are more adequate for their services. for the people they serve ultimately. And I think that's the part that gets lost a lot of times. And when we get into payer negotiations, is that these benefits are being paid on behalf of people receiving care. And so it's three parts. What's equitable for the payer to spend, what's equitable for the provider to charge, and what's going to produce the best outcome for the individual being served. And how do we manage that process in a way that makes sense? That really does make sense. And so I think there's a lot to be said for better negotiations coming when we have these kinds of changes and when we have these kinds of regulations being examined and leveled, and we have, sort of this neutral place of stabilization. It definitely gives providers a better opportunity to demonstrate through measurement-based care what they're doing and how they're doing and why they should be receiving better than average rates in many cases. But it's kind of like the old adage: if you take a room full of people, say there's 10 people in a room, and you ask them who's a better than average driver, more than half will raise their hand, which is statistically impossible for that to be true. Right. Usually 7 out of 10 people will raise their hand and say, I'm a better than average driver. And while, some of that might be true for some, it's not true for all 7 out of 10. Right. So being able to have the tools and the opportunity to negotiate with payers about your specific services and how they impact the people that you're serving, we kind of circle back to that severe and persistent mental health need question. Right. Is that the audience for you to serve? Is that, the care that you excel at providing? Is that something
Sure.
you want to take on? And not just is it worth it, but, is it the right thing for your providers and the people you want to serve within that? And can you do it in a way that makes sense for you as a provider in a business to provide a person receiving care who has a need, and for the funding sources such as insurance payers to reimburse at a level that makes sense for that care?
All right. Changes in payer relations, regulatory, all good things. So,
Well, it does bring up something that I think is important as well, which is a lot of focus on value-based care. Right?
sure.
As people look at these things and say, well, what does this mean? It certainly means that there's an opportunity to look at being able to say, well, how do we negotiate more consistent rates based on quality metrics in our service? And how do we agree upon that? Right? What do measurement-based care practices need to be? And a lot of people are looking at it and a lot of people are talking about it, but when it comes to actually producing it, it becomes a challenge because a lot of people
Yeah.
look at value-based care and think, oh, well, this is just a way for me to get paid more without doing more work. And it's not really necessarily true. It's better measured work that shows the value of the care being provided. But again, the key is that it has to show the value of the care being provided. And so
Well,
being able to do that, I think, is important.
well, absolutely. I mean, and look, this is a big rabbit hole, the values based care conversation, and I know from spending time down at Value this past week, and talking to a lot of the large providers and all of this. It's a CEO of a very large provider that we have a relationship with said to me, they're actually, we can come with all the data and the information, but currently there's really no table for us to even be sitting at. Meaning there's really not a lot from the payer side saying, yeah, like here's the table where we're sitting, here's what's on the menu. Would you like to come join us and kind of engage in this conversation? And so really, I mean, everything that I've been spending time in the last year or so around this conversation is really it's data, right? Like, let's ensure that from the provider side, we're actually just in a position where we're starting to track data to show what we're actually doing, to make sure things are flowing correctly in our data systems and our data management systems. Because at some point that table will be set and there will be an opportunity to start having those conversations. But really, unless you see otherwise, Jonathan, I haven't seen anything to suggest that there is a lot behind the idea of, in 2024, we're going to go secure value-based care contracts.
I agree with that completely. I think focusing on measurement-based care is the way to start. really building towards something that there is to offer, and there is a system to teach payers how to work with it.
Sure.
And I think you're exactly right about that part of the conversation, where there are some that want to talk about it from the payer side, and are certainly willing, but there's so much work to be done on the provider side of having uniform information and having uniform and agreed upon systems of measurement and care, that really can work towards that. Yeah, I do. I think there'll be progress, but I caution people to look at it as a way to secure higher rates. I think being able to demonstrate what you do well in your negotiations is the best path forward. And those who don't participate in that, or don't start really getting quite detailed about the measurement-based care they provide, are going to find themselves in a few years wishing they had, and scrambling to try and figure out how.
Yeah. Well, and so it sounds to me like the shift that almost needs to begin is let's start talking about measurement-based care and not as much about values-based care, because ultimately, once the table is set, if we've been operating and measuring what we're doing, with good systems and good analysis, then we can come sit at that table for value-based care. But really, it's a measurement-based care conversation as of today.
I agree. I think a lot of people want to get to the dessert, but they haven't figured out how to order the appetizer yet.
You always have beautiful food metaphors. I love this. Okay, so we've covered a decent amount. I mean, we've talked about the trend towards primary and mental health care. We've talked about some of the regulatory and payer shifts. We've then taken that and dovetailed a bit into the values-based and measurement-based care conversation. But continuing to just look at 24, what else are you seeing is important for behavioral health to be paying attention to this year?
I think it's twofold. I think that there'll be growth in outpatient services. A lot of the stabilization in residential care on the substance use side, and the increased need on the mental health residential side are going to have a focus of people really looking at outpatient services and refining how they deliver those continuums of care to be more cost effective and more impactful. I think people are going to start looking at old ideas as new again, which I know is a trend of ours from last year's. What's old is new. Again, I think people are going to be looking at the untapped areas within outpatient services that they just haven't, they've not spent a lot of time or energy looking at figuring out how to utilize effectively, because the reimbursements on other sides of the equation were there, and margins were good enough, and care was, sufficient enough. People were getting better. But I think as more complexity shows up in people being served, as more complexity is required to respond to those needs, as more communities start to diversify, providing sources for social wellness, I think that mental health outpatient and outpatient services in general are going to continue to need attention as regulations change. Some of those specific
Sure.
CMS reimbursements were about increases to certain outpatient codes, right?
Mm.
Very specific ones that had needed increased reimbursement for years to make sense, and to meet market demand as more people have exchange-based, Medicaid-based policies. I think the outpatient opportunity is there. And again, the destigmatization of mental health in general, and a whole new generation that is welcome to therapy, as opposed to, talking quiet corners about going to
Sure.
therapy. I think you'll see more people embracing outpatient care, for different reasons, but not necessarily for moderate to severe, behavioral health concerns, but more, catch it where it starts. Let me
Yeah.
address this in a little bit of therapy. Let me do better in this area of my life. Let me manage stress differently. Let me have a better quality of relationship, right? We're going to see things like family programming, marriage and family will be on the rise for sure. Programs that have outpatient continuums that haven't dedicated a lot to sustainable alumni relations will start, using outpatient opportunities to foster those care supports differently over the long term of recovery in both substance use and mental health. You're going to see more activity in the applied behavioral analysis space on an outpatient basis, for sure.
Yeah.
Foster care systems are trying to get really creative about solving, needs of individuals and families through, modified comprehensive outpatient programming. So you'll see a lot more of that. And I think it leads into, a really big piece is that when it comes to growth, again, in the M&A space, the merger and acquisition activity, it's going to be about strategic priorities. Programs aren't just going to come to market, out of nowhere. It's going to be owner operators that have built up that maybe held on a little too long, maybe had an opportunity during COVID to sell, but, thought, well, if I just hold out a little bit longer, I'll get a little bit more for the value of my business.
Sure.
And, now that they've had some time to recalibrate and recover, or finding out just how taxing that period of time was, and that they're going to want to exit.
Yeah.
And I think, existing continuums are going to be much more strategic about what they're doing in terms of acquiring or merging, groups, large groups networks of mental health will start to form up, largely to help consolidate costs on one side from the providers, right? A lot more joint ventures, a lot more, multi-state consortiums of, smaller group practices coming together to bear the back office costs together. To be able to maintain the quality of care that they do on an outpatient basis. But those larger continuums, those multi-state consortiums of treatment providers are going to find themselves, looking at markets differently than they have. They're not going to be quick just to bolt something on because the market is quote unquote hot. It's really going to say, well, how does this fit into our long-term strategy? And, is this a part of that or not? Not just, oh, this is a good idea and we can make, as you said, 15 or 18%. It's going to be like, well, how does it make sense in a 5 to 10 year strategy as opposed to a 2 to 3 year strategy? Since activity has changed and the costs of capital are still fairly high,
Yeah.
you're going to see more folks, that are owner operators, continuing to focus on recovering the balance of their trailing 12 months to get their business in a position to sell at a reasonable price for them to exit, and a manageable price for a buyer. But you're going to see those strategic providers really expanding their networks very, very carefully, much more thoughtfully, much more deliberate services, rather than adding a service line, in a region because they have that in some other place. They're going to look for, unique services that maybe aren't covered in a market, where there's a rural population. They're going to look for rural outpatient business that really serves that market. And even though that may not be their flagship service, they're going to look at that and think, does this fit into our strategy? Yes or no?
That's a lot. Okay. So I am going to assume you probably have more.
Well, a couple of things, but I'll pick two.
Okay.
I'll
Good.
pick three. I'll keep one really brief. I'll keep one super brief. One is artificial intelligence integrations. We saw a huge proliferation of everybody looking to figure out how to use AI. And although there are tremendous advances in the speed of information processing and what artificial intelligence engines can do towards productivity, it's not to the place where artificial intelligence is going to necessarily replace anybody's positions, but help them be a little bit more efficient in doing the work that they do. So I think those kinds of integrations are worth paying attention to, right?
Makes
And being
total
able
sense.
being able to innovate is important, but looking for these massive disruptive opportunities, I don't think is a real thing. I think that's the
Not
flash
yet.
of. No, I mean, you still need people to make sense of the information that an AI engine gives you.
Yep.
It can write a treatment plan, but is it a good treatment plan? And is it the right treatment plan for that individual? You still need a person to interpret that. Certainly.
Okay.
So I think wisely integrated, looking at integrating AI wisely on an operation or operational side is really a smart place. Looking at data mining, looking at data aggregating, Those types of things I think will be very helpful. And looking to the software vendors, that are being progressive about how they teach you how to use the AI they're building in their systems,
Sure.
is certainly a great way to learn, because they've spent the last number of years really trying to figure it out to bring better service of their products and services to you to help you do your job better in serving people receiving care. And that's the thread I think that's important. Um,
Right.
I think the last two pieces are really, one is on marketing. And now more than ever, I think relational marketing will be more valuable than ever. And I think
Okay.
diversifying what relational marketing looks like, the traditional business development, the marketing rep out there, I think they're going to have to work harder and differently than they have in the past. But I think that's where growth is going to come from a lot of businesses. Artificial intelligence engines on both sides of the digital media equation are working to balance each other out. And so opportunities from digital marketing are already well understood in a lot of behavioral health. But if you're going to look for growth, it shouldn't be on increasing your digital spend. It should be on a more comprehensive relational marketing strategy of new sources and diversifying sources, and teaching a new generation of marketers how to do that really well.
Sure.
People still refer to people first. Everyone checks Google, but they take a trusted resource over Google any day.
They do. And, it's not to go too far down this rabbit hole, but it is an important one. What it does ultimately is it creates balance, right, in an overall marketing and sales strategy for a provider, right, or an organization, which is that digital will perform very well in February, right, but might be down some in March. And where that gets made up is the relational marketing and sales side of things. And so the providers that we've been working with that have been consistently growing their census month over month have fully integrated this strategy, right? Uh, and it's very easy to look at the data and the metrics to say this is exactly how it works. 1 month it's incredibly strong on the relational side. 1 month it's incredibly strong on the digital side. Some months it's strong on both. Some months it's a little weak on both. But ultimately, what it ends up doing is really balancing out a census over time, right? And then getting to a place to continually grow that census too. So, yeah, I appreciate that you kind of circle back to that. That's a whole nother conversation is where we're at with our sales teams in the space. But thank you for bringing that up as number 2 out of 3.
And my last one is related, but it's really human capital management. Needs and opportunities will influence the growth in 2024. We're going to continue to see workforce shortages and increasing workforce demands, especially in behavioral health. It's going to be harder to get certain people trained in time. A whole generation's now being inspired to pursue behavioral health as a workforce discipline, but it's going to take a few years for that generation to be ready.
Sure.
But I think the reality is that when you're spending in a business, whether you're on the merger and acquisition buy side or the sell side, you're an owner operator, investing in your people you can never go wrong with investing in the people producing care, because that's what it is people serving people and people helping people. And so, I think that there does need to be more focus on that. And again, it's not just random training. It's looking at your strategic plan and what are the training that you want to provide and investing in your folks. Business development. Do they know how to track their sales differently and their attributions, not just what's in your CRM system, but do they know how to diversify and build those relationships? Do they need to learn how to interface with different business disciplines for new sources of target audiences to serve? Things like that. So I think, and that's one side of the human capital management investment. I think the other side of it is on the behavioral health provider side and the treatment side is we've not spent enough time really helping people in vocational rehabilitation and finding meaningful work and finding the right work, not just what makes money, right? You can make money being a YouTuber, being a content creator. You can make,
Sure.
probably a better living than I make doing that. And many do. But is it the kind of work that you want to be doing? Is it sustainable? Is it meaningful? And how does it fit into your overall mental health and wellness? So on the provider side, I think there is more that we can do when it comes to things like the shortages in skilled labor, for example. Huge shortages in skilled labor right now. You know, are we doing enough as a provider to help those we serve really look at vocational satisfaction and vocational rehabilitation as a part of their overall behavioral health care? And historically, the answer is that can gets kicked down the road pretty far enough where it rolls off the side of the road and it becomes someone else's trash. And that's unfortunate. It's truly unfortunate, because it is a domain that does need to be tracked in the criteria for all mental health care. But again, tends to get deferred the further down the line you go. And ultimately, it's somebody's responsibility to really focus on that. And job satisfaction and job security is one of the key ways for people to reduce stress, right? When it comes to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's not just to add another pill because someone has depression. They're sad because they don't make
Right.
enough money. They're miserable because they're in a job they can't stand. They have, a fear because they've built a lifestyle that they, can only subsist on credit card debt. Helping people look at vocational strategies that are more sustainable is something that providers can really focus on. And then again, when it comes to reimbursements, tie those outcomes back to better reimbursements for care, because they're helping people's lives truly change and solving long-term sustainable stress reduction in someone's life that impacts their overall healthcare. So I certainly urge everyone to look at their part in what they're doing when it comes to human capital management, both investing in your people as providers, investing in services that really run in an ethical way to meet your needs as a consumer, and as providers are caring for people, to not overlook that and just kick that can and defer that part of the domain diagnostics down to the next provider. Really being able to address it, or at least being willing to do what you can at the level of care you're providing service. And if we're seeing a rise in mental health outpatient, it's going to be mental health outpatient's job to really look at some of those things together with people, and help them grow in a stabilized way, and watch the benefits of helping people develop their vocational security in a different way, and watch the just profound impact that can have on someone's wellness.
Hmm. Well, Jonathan DiCarlo, wealth of wisdom and knowledge and experience. One of these days we need to come on and do your story and how you got here, because boy, are you just full
It's a
of
very
wisdom.
strange meandering pathway that as a collector, it's really not me. It's the experiences of others I've served that I'm the vehicle for being able to share the histories and the past, the present, and hopefully the clearer and clarified future for some. I'm just here to share the information.
I love it. Well, hopefully anyone that's watching has really enjoyed. We'll continue to be putting some of this on, but as always, just incredibly grateful to learn and to be a part of a thought-provoking conversation. And hopefully our viewers took something out of this to help them align to at least what we're seeing, which I assume it's probably what they're seeing as well, as we continue to progress here into 2024.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing your time with us.
Yeah. So onwards and upwards, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, everyone.